A dark chase leads a silent hound. Part 1. Jean Valjean had immediately left the boulevard and began to thread the streets, making as many turns as he could, returning sometimes upon his track to make sure that he was not followed. The moon was full. Jean Valjean was not sorry for that. The moon, still near the horizon, cut large prisms of light and shade in the streets. Jean Valjean could glide along the houses and the walls on the dark side, and observe the light side. He did not, perhaps, sufficiently realize that the obscure side escaped him. However, in all the deserted little streets in the neighborhood of the Rue de Poliveau, he felt sure that no one was behind him. Jean Valjean described many and varied labyrinths in the Quartier Mouffetard, which was asleep already, as if it were still under the discipline of the Middle Age and the yoke of the curfew. He produced different combinations, in wise strategy, but with the Rue Saint-Cyr and the Rue Copeau, the Rue Battoir Saint-Victor, and the Rue de Puy-Erlemite. As 11 o'clock struck in the tower of Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, he crossed the Rue de Pontoise in front of the Bureau of the Commissary of Police, which is at number 14. Some moments afterward, the instinct of which we have already spoken made him turn his head. At this moment, he saw distinctly, thanks to the commissary's lamp, which revealed them, 3 men following him quite near, pass one under another under this lamp on the dark side of the street. One of these men entered the passage leading to the commissary's house. The one in advance appeared to him decidedly suspicious. "Come, child," said he to Cosette, and he made haste to get out of the Rue de Pontoise. He made a circuit, went round the Arcade de Pétriarche, which was closed on account of the lateness of the hour, walked rapidly through the Rue de l'Épée du Bois, the Rue de la Belette, and plunged into Rue des Postes. There was a square there, where the Collège Rouen now is, and from which branches off the Rue Neuve Sainte-Geneviève. The moon lighted up this square brightly. Jean Valjean concealed himself in a doorway, calculating that if these men were still following him, he could not fail to get a good view of them when they crossed this lighted space. In fact, 3 minutes had not elapsed when the men appeared. There were now 4 of them. All were tall, dressed in long brown coats, with round hats and great clubs in their hands. They were not less fearfully forbidding by their size and their large fists than by their steady tread in the darkness. One would have taken them for 4 spectres in citizen's dress. They stopped in the center of the square and formed a little group, like people consulting. They appeared undecided. The man who seemed to be the leader turned and energetically pointed in the direction in which Jean Valjean was. One of the others seemed to insist with some obstinacy on the contrary direction. At the instant when the leader turned, the moon shone full in his face. Jean Valjean recognized Javert perfectly. Part 2. Uncertainty was at an end for Jean Valjean. Happily, it still continued with these men. He took advantage of their hesitation. It was time lost for them, gained for him. He came out from the doorway in which he was concealed, and made his way into the Rue des Postes toward the region of the Jardin des Plantes. Cosette began to be tired. He took her in his arms and carried her. There was nobody in the streets, and the lamps had not been lighted on account of the moon. He doubled his pace. He passed through the Rue de la Clef, then by the Fontaine de Saint-Victoire along the Jardin des Plantes by the lower streets, and reached the quay. There he looked around. The quay was deserted. The streets were deserted. Nobody behind him. He took a breath. He arrived at the bridge of Austerlitz. A large cart was passing the Seine at the same time, and like him was going toward the right bank. This could be made of use. He could go the whole length of the bridge in the shade of this cart. From the point where he was, he could see the whole length of the bridge of Austerlitz. 4 shadows at that moment entered upon the bridge. These shadows were coming from the Jardin des Plantes toward the right bank. These 4 shadows were the 4 men. Jean Valjean felt a shudder like that of the deer when he sees the hounds again upon his track. One hope was left him. By plunging into the little street before him, if he could succeed in reaching the woodyards, the marshes, the fields, the open grounds, he could escape. It seemed to him that he might trust himself to this silent little street. He entered it. Part 3. Some 300 paces on, he reached a point where the street forked. It divided into 2 streets, the one turning off obliquely to the left, the other to the right. Jean Valjean had before him the 2 branches of a Y, Which should he choose? He did not hesitate. He took the right. Why? Because the left branch led towards the faubourg, that is to say, towards the inhabited region, and the right branch toward the country, that is, toward the uninhabited region. He turned from time to time and looked back. He took care to keep always on the dark side of the street. The street was straight behind him. The 2 or 3 first times he turned, he saw nothing. The silence was complete, and he kept on his way somewhat reassured. Suddenly, on turning again, he thought he saw in the portion of the street through which he had just passed, far in the obscurity, something which stirred. He plunged forward rather than walked, hoping to find some side street by which to escape, and once more to elude his pursuers. He came to a wall. This wall, however, did not prevent him from going further. It was a wall forming the side of a cross alley, in which the street Jean Valjean was then in came to an end. Here again he must decide. Should he take the right or the left? He looked to the right. The alley ran out to a space between some buildings that were mere sheds or barns, then terminated abruptly. The end of this blind alley was plain to be seen, a great white wall. He looked to the left. The alley on this side was open, and about 200 paces further on ran into a street of which was an affluent. In this direction lay safety. The instant Jean Valjean decided to turn to the left, to try to reach the street at which he saw the end at the alley, he perceived, at the corner of the alley and the street towards where he was going, a sort of black motionless statue. It was a man, who had just been posted there, evidently, and who was waiting for him, guarding the passage. Jean Valjean was startled. Such was the quarter in the last century. The Petit Picpus had what we just called a Y of streets, formed by the Rue de Chemin Vert Saint-Antoine, dividing into 2 branches, and taking on the left the name of Petite Rue Picpus, and on the right the name of the Rue Polonceau. The 2 branches of the Y were joined at the top as by a bar. This bar was called the Rue Droit Mur. The Rue Polonceau ended there. The Petit Picpus passed beyond, rising toward the Marché Lenoir. He who, coming from the Seine, reached the extremity of the Rue Polonceau, had on his left the Rue Droit Mur, turning sharply at a right angle. Before him, the side wall of that street, and on his right a truncated prolongation of the Rue Droit Mur, without thoroughfare, called the cul-de-sac généreux. Jean Valjean was in this place. As we have said, on perceiving the black form standing sentry at the corner of the Rue Droit Mur and the Petite Rue Picpus, he was startled. There was no doubt he was watched by the shadow. What should he do? There was now no time to turn back. What he had seen moving in the obscurity some distance behind him the moment before was undoubtedly Javert and his squad. Javert probably had already reached the commencement of the street, of which Jean Valjean was at the end. Javert, to all appearances, was acquainted with this little trap, and had taken his precautions by sending one of his men to guard the exit. These conjectures, so like certainties, whirled about wildly in Jean Valjean's troubled brain, as a handful of dust flies before a sudden blast. He scrutinized the cul-de-sac généreux. There were high walls. He scrutinized the Petite Rue Picpus. There was a sentinel. He saw the dark form repeated in black upon the white pavement flooded with the moonlight. To advance was to fall upon that man. To go back was to throw himself into Javert's hands. Jean Valjean felt as if caught by a chain that was slowly winding up. He looked up into the sky in despair. Part 4. At this moment, a muffled and regular sound began to make itself heard at some distance. Jean Valjean ventured to thrust his head a little way round the corner of the street. 7 or 8 soldiers, formed in platoon, had just turned into the Rue Polonceau. He saw the gleam of their bayonets. They were coming toward him. The soldiers, at whose head he distinguished the tall form of Javert, advanced slowly and with precaution. They stopped frequently. It was plain they were exploring all the recesses of all the walls and the entrances of doors and alleys. It was, and here conjecture could not be deceived, some patrol which Javert had met and which he had put into requisition. Javert's 2 assistants marched in the ranks. At the rate at which they were marching, and the stops they were making, it would take them about a quarter of an hour to arrive at the spot where Jean Valjean was. It was a frightful moment. A few minutes separated Jean Valjean from that awful precipice which was opening before him for the 3rd time. And the galleys now were no longer simply the galleys. They were Cosette lost forever. That is to say, a life in death. There was now only one thing possible. Jean Valjean had this peculiarity, that he might be said to carry two knapsacks. In one he had the thoughts of a saint, in the other the formidable talents of a convict. He helped himself from one or the other as occasion required. Among other resources, thanks to his numerous escapes from the galleys at Toulon, he had, it will be remembered, become master of that incredible art of raising himself in the right angle of a wall, if need be to the height of a sixth story, an art without ladders or props, by mere muscular strength, supporting himself by the back of his neck, his shoulders, his hips, and his knees, hardly making use of the few projections of the stone, which rendered so terrible and so celebrated the corner of the yard of the Conciergerie of Paris, by which, some 20 years ago, the convict Batmol made his escape. Jean Valjean measured with his eyes the wall above which he saw a lime tree. It was about 18 feet high. The wall was capped by a flat stone without any projection. The difficulty was Cosette. Cosette did not know how to scale a wall. Abandon her? Jean Valjean did not think of it. To carry her was impossible. The whole strength of a man is necessary to accomplish these strange ascents. The least burden would make him lose his centre of gravity, and he would fall. He needed a cord. Jean Valjean had none. Where could he find a cord at midnight, in the Rue Polonceau? Truly, at that instant, if Jean Valjean had had a kingdom, he would have given it for a rope. All extreme situations have their flashes which sometimes make us blind, sometimes illuminate us. The despairing gaze of Jean Valjean encountered the lamp-post in the cul-de-sac Généreux. At this epoch there were no gaslights in the streets of Paris. At nightfall they lighted the street lamps, which were placed at intervals and were raised and lowered by means of a rope traversing the street from end to end, running through the grooves of posts. The reel on which this rope was wound was enclosed below the lantern in a little iron box, the key of which was kept by the lamplighter, and the rope itself was protected by a casing of metal. Jean Valjean, with the energy of a final struggle, crossed the street at a bound, entered this cul-de-sac, sprang the bolt of the little box with the point of his knife, and an instant after was back at the side of Cosette. He had a rope. These desperate inventors of expedients, in their struggles with fatality, move electrically in case of need. We have explained that the street lamps had not been lighted that night. The lamp in the cul-de-sac Généreux was then, as a matter of course, extinguished like the rest, and one might pass by without even noticing that it was not in its place. Meanwhile, the hour, the place, the darkness, the preoccupation of Jean Valjean, his singular actions, his going to and fro, all this began to disturb Cosette. Any other child would have uttered loud cries long before. She contented herself with pulling Jean Valjean by the skirt of his coat. The sound of the approaching patrol was constantly becoming more and more distinct. "Father," said she, in a whisper, "I am afraid. Who is it that is coming?" "Hush," answered the unhappy man. "It is the Thénardiers." Cosette shuddered. He added, "Don't say a word. I'll take care of you. If you cry, if you make any noise, the Thénardiers will hear you. She's coming to catch you." Then, without any haste, without doing anything, a second time with a firm and rapid decision, so much more remarkable at such a moment when the patrol and Javert might come upon him at any instant, he took off his cravat, passed it around Cosette's body under the arms, taking care that it should not hurt the child, attached this cravat to the end of the rope by means of the knot which the seamen call a swallow knot, took the other end of the rope in his teeth, took off his shoes and stockings and threw them over the wall, and began to raise himself in the angle of the wall and the gable with as much solidity and certainty as if he had the rounds of a ladder under his heels and his elbows. Half a minute had not passed before he was on his knees on the wall. Cosette watched him, stupefied, without saying a word. Jean Valjean's charge in the name of the Thénardiers had made her dumb. All at once, she heard Jean Valjean's voice calling to her in a low whisper, "Put your back against the wall." She obeyed. "Don't speak, and don't be afraid," added Jean Valjean, and she felt herself lifted from the ground. Before she had time to think where she was at the top of the wall. Jean Valjean seized her, put her on his back, took her two little hands in his left hand, lay down flat and crawled along the top of the wall. As he had supposed, there was a building there, the roof of which sloped very nearly to the ground, with a gentle inclination. A fortunate circumstance, for the wall was much higher on this side than on the street. Jean Valjean saw the ground beneath him at a great depth. He had just reached the inclined plane of the roof, and had not yet left the crest of the wall, when a violent uproar proclaimed the arrival of the patrol. He heard the thundering voice of Javert. "Search the cul-de-sac! The Rue Droit Mort is guarded, the Rue Petit Pouce also. I'll answer for it if he is in the cul-de-sac. The soldiers rushed into the cul-de-sac general. Jean Valjean slid down the roof, keeping hold of Cosette, reached the lime tree, and jumped to the ground. Whether from terror or from courage, Cosette had not uttered a whisper. Her hands were a little scraped.